This is Farmers Inside Track, South Africa's most downloaded farmers podcast and winner of the 2024 One IFRA Award for the world's best news podcast. I'm Duncan Masiwa from Food for Mzansi. In this episode of our ABSA Agri-Trends series, we explore South Africa's livestock markets, showing resilience amid disease outbreaks, supply challenges, and shifting global demand. The discussion, led by Ivor Price, features ABSA's agricultural economists Zama Shangweni and Kensani Mashimbi.
We've had quite a lengthy conversation about import tariffs, but I think what's more imminent is what now, as of August 2025.
The spring edition of ABSA's Agri-Trends report has just been released, and today we'll be zooming in on some of the high-value commodities, the likes of citrus and macadamias. It is no secret that President Donald Trump's controversial 30% tariffs have shaken up the market, and to help us make sense of it all, two of my favorite agricultural economists. Ladies, thank you for joining me. The US import tariffs, we've spoken about it at length, and South Africans are buzzing about it. But how are South Africa's oranges being affected, and what strategies are currently being implemented to respond to it all? Sama, maybe we kick off with you.
We've had quite a lengthy conversation about import tariffs, but I think what's more imminent is what now, as of August 2025. So what we do notice is that South Africa and Chile are quite dominant in the same window period within the USA market. And what that means is we have to keep a close eye on what Chile is doing in terms of production. So they're sitting at the universal tariff rate of 10%, and we're sitting at 30%, which is quite a very pronounced competitive disadvantage for South Africa. But what's important to note is that Chile is going to have issues filling up the gap in terms of supply, especially for the late season. And then the question arises, who is going to fill up that gap? This is a gap that South Africa used to own in the market, but it's the fact of the matter is that things are uncertain right now because of the tariff implications. So we started using a scenario strategy when we started thinking about, okay, what would be some of the possible outcomes? And I think what's important to note is that that market gap is going to be quite important, and we hold market share in the USA. So if we're unable to export volumes to that market, the market is going to experience shortages. But bringing it back home, what can be practically done? Because we cannot shy away from the fact that, this import tariff has had negative impact on how we view the success or the progress of our orange industry and how we're going to perform at the end of 2025. So a potential outcome would be, if Chile cannot fill in that market gap, we can still take advantage of it. We've had conversations, we've been to the Western Cape, we've sat with exporters and some of these producers, and depending on how much you're producing as an individual growing group, if your farming operation was mostly dependent on the USA program, then you're more inclined to go into the USA and negotiate with your buyers, which are retailers in this instance, to say, is it possible for you guys to help us cushion this import price? So meaning that exports are most likely going to continue for those particularly industry stakeholders. However, it has to be that there's a conversation that is had with a buyer to say, can they absorb at least a percentage of this import tariff? For individuals or stakeholders that are not necessarily dependent on USA as an export market, they have some legroom from what we've touched upon in terms of market expansion. So they can find some cushioning in terms of moving more volumes to other destinations such as the EU or the UK. But for individuals that do not have that option, might just have to weather this storm. And it's a conversation around market share. We've built, I think, more than 20 years of market share in the USA. If you look at the relationships that we've established with the retailers, you consider the positive margins, which are quite significant if you're comparing it to another market such as the EU. So we do not want to forgo this opportunity or forgo the market share. And so it is a costly strategy to try and negotiate and export at this elevated tariff. However, it's more sustainable in the longer term if we can weather the storm in the meantime, so that when we do, which is hopefully something that can happen, reach a favorable agreement in terms of the tariff discussion between the USA and South Africa, that market share still remains in the USA and we can continue trade. However, moving completely out of the USA entirely is going to cause problems in terms of market share loss. And like I've already mentioned, it does take a couple of years to establish that. So it's not going to be easy getting back into there. Yeah.
I've had a number of conversations with producers and exporters, and I think I understand it a little bit better. What I'm then hearing is hold on to the market share if the US is important to you, because it might take another 10 or 20 years to bounce back.
What's important here, I think, to highlight at the end of the day is learnings will come to in a way of how the US consumer responds. At the end of the day, they are the ones, if there's a shortage, who are going to be charged a higher price. Are there going to be pushback from the consumers that say, you know what, this is unaffordable, or will they move to other food categories? And what's also interesting to note is that Donald Trump, in times where it's been self-serving, it's been beneficial for the US, he has considered and opened up those doors. But we, as Zama said, we continue to monitor the developments in terms of communications, and hopefully we can reach that trade agreement.
Zama, this might actually still turn into in our favor if we could shift the conversation slightly from oranges to my favorite fruit, which is soft citrus.
Yeah.
What are some of the market dynamics currently playing out and shaping the soft citrus exports in 2025?
So South Africa is a dominant player within the EU market, alike Peru as a Southern Hemisphere competitor. So if I bring some focus on global production, it has declined slightly because there's been some pullback from Turkey and the EU in terms of anticipated supplies. So they have overestimated their forecasts and came in a bit lower. But if you look at the seasonal dynamics, specifically in the EU, in the earlier season, you get to see Morocco and Egypt play quite a strong role in terms of supplies to the EU. And what we've seen is quite a strong prices at the beginning of the season because of Turkey and the EU coming lower with supplies. So Morocco and Egypt did sort of benefit from those prices. But when we started moving into mid-season, that's where we saw less of Moroccan fruit and Egyptian fruit on the market. In fact, Egypt quite finished their season a little bit earlier than anticipated. But if you move into the mid-season, you see Peru, the two Southern Hemisphere guys, Peru and South Africa playing in there. We've had quite positive climatic conditions. The prospects were looking good. So our estimates were actually forecasted up both South Africa and Peru. And then what we saw, a little bit of moderation in terms of prices because of slight increases in volumes for the mid-season. But now we're entering the late season, and it's more again of a scenario, what is going to happen. So we're quite curious. But taking it back into global dynamics and the role of soft citrus from a South African and a Peruvian perspective into the US, South Africa and Peru, again, similar to oranges, they trade during the same window period. And they too are sitting on a 10% import tariff. So we're not quite sure yet what Peru is going to do, but there's two possible outcomes from the situation, which will drive price levels in the late season for soft citrus in Europe. So if Peru decides that they're going to continue sending volumes at levels seen pre-tariff, the tariff period in 2024 and 2023, then we might have some scope in terms of positive price margins seen in the EU, because most of that volume is going to be sitting in the USA. But if Peru comes under pressure, because what we see with citrus in terms of how much prices consumers are able to take, there's sort of a ceiling, right? So if Peruvian fruit is moved into the US and it drives up prices, they are driven up, it's going to drive up consumer inflation in relation to soft citrus specifically. Consumers are going to reach a point where they say, we can't buy this anymore. And then Peru might change the tide and say, now we're going to switch to send to the EU. So it depends on what Peru is going to do. But in an instance where Peru continues to consistently export volumes they previously did to the USA, we might have a window opportunity as South Africa to divert fruit that would have went into the United States into Europe. The size and the timing of that opportunity is still uncertain at this stage, but we are optimistic that should that be the situation, we are going to have a little bit of a window opportunity to do something with volumes that could have been destined for the USA. If Peru decides that they are not interested in continuing to send, because it could be a price margin pressure on them, they're getting less money for their fruit that is being sent there. They're going to send more products to Europe. That's going to saturate the market, and as a result, we're going to experience year-on-year lower average prices for soft citrus within the EU. So it's scenario-based, but I think it paints the picture to say global dynamics is affecting specific fruit categories and how our competitors are going to make decisions. So we can just see the decisions made by one individual actually impacting the rest of the world. This is quite a great example of how exactly President Trump has done that.
I was quite pleased to note that lemon exports have been doing really well. We've seen quite a strong performance in terms of lemon export. What were the factors that contributed to that? And I'm wondering if there are any risks, or is it all hunky-dory, just some sunshine ahead for the lemon industry?
So to Dr. Marlene Lowe, our mentor, so she likes saying the prices are dancing to global tunes. So we see that in the lemon market because it's a broader global production scenario that played out where Spain quality was lower, and then Turkey finished their season earlier. So there was a gap for South Africa to capitalize on that. Also fetched higher prices because the response from consumer was quite positive. So what also added to that was that supply was also positive locally. So it was quite a good surprise for the industry as well. And we capitalized on that gap. But going forward, considering that lemons are quite inelastic, I mean, if you go there is so many lemons you can consume, although noting there are more ways lemons are used now. You take it to the gin, you use it for fish, but there is so much you can buy. So if the production is to normalize in the coming season, then prices are expected to normalize back. And
I'm not a big fan of lemons and gin, particularly, but I do love my gin with some blueberries.
Oh.
We've seen them really take off. Are blueberries impacted by what President Trump calls the Liberation Day tariffs?
Yes, Ivo. I think all commodity groups in one way or another do feel a little bit of impact. So South Africa is not a significant exporter into the United States in terms of blueberries. However, Southern Hemisphere producers such as Peru and Chile are our competitors. So again, what they decide to do does impact global prices and what's going to happen with South African prices as well. So in that scenario, tariffs have indirectly impacted the blueberry industry in South Africa. And how that has happened exactly, Peruvian volumes are up year on year. Chile is still modest, but obviously not producing at levels that they did in previous years. So then again, the 10% universal tariff is imposed on both Peru and Chile. If they continue to supply into the USA, then we might have some scope in the European markets and even in the UK for positive prices, because it's going to create a market shortage. However, if they decide again that they would like to divert most of their fruit into the EU market, that's going to extort prices. But I think in the late season, we had a good start to the season. Prices are quite positive. And again, the problem is also perpetuated by the fact that Peru is looking at a record and very late bumper crop this year. So it's inevitable that Peru at a certain stage will distort EU market prices. We're just keeping very close to the timing of when exactly it happens. We're hoping that it doesn't coincide with Peru deciding to divert its fruits into the EU with that bumper crop. Then it would be a challenge for South African blueberries to receive that high or anticipated average prices on markets. So it is an indirect impact.
It's absolutely incredible and a bit astonishing to realize how the world could impact, our fruits. Yeah. We've mentioned Peru, we've mentioned the US, we've mentioned Morocco. And if we're looking at table grapes, I have noted in the Agri-Trends report that India and China have been increasing their production when it comes to table grapes. Kensani, what does this mean for South Africa and our global competitiveness?
Sure. I like what you mentioned about how these global dynamics continue to shape our dynamics locally. And I guess that's what happens when you expand production and want to play in the export market. So China, as we alluded in some of our other analysis and talks within the grains dynamics, is increasing production where it can. So we see that happening with table grapes. They have now moved from net importer to net exporter, exporting to some of the other Asian countries, taking up space there. And India is also in the process of transitioning. So those are two big giant players to watch, because that impacts our competitiveness within the market.
To add on that, Kenzie, I think, you touched on port efficiencies. It's quite a significant role with the perishable products such as table grapes. I think it applies the same as well for blueberries. And what's another important factor is market reputation. So if we can deliver good quality fruit on time, it makes us a reputable country. And then you get exposure to programs and you retain that market share. But if you do have instances where you struggle with that, it does eat away, or it does steal away in the way that we are represented as a country. So that's also quite an important factor that we keep track of. Is our port efficiencies improving? Like Kensani said, we've had a good season. The wins were great. So if we can keep that up as the government, as the industry, it's going to really help us, particularly in this instance where we're facing a very negative situation in terms of the tariffs. We can maintain existing markets. It would also allow some cushioning as well for specific industries that are affected.
We have seen quite an admirable effort by Transnet as well as government to fix some of our challenges at ports. We can't talk high-value commodities without talking about macadamias, also impacted by the export situation. How's that going for us?
So I'm going to allude to Kensani's theory around certain parts of a cow being destined for certain markets. And that now forces you to go watch the livestock chapter video, but similar to them. So just to paint some context, right? South Africa exports around about 41% of their macadamia production to the USA. But if we zoom into the portion of the nut that they export, it becomes a different dynamic. And industry stakeholders have been quite optimistic. If you look at the number we export and, the optimism, it kind of doesn't make sense. But just for context, the nut is considered a whole nut. There's specific pieces. So you get a whole, you get a half, you get pieces, and then you get fines, which are really small pieces. So when you crack a nut, you're not really sure which part of the nut you're going to get. So if I'm talking now specifically to kernels, the kernel industry where you would harvest the nut and then crack it and then see what you have, South Africa plays in the lower style nut where we send your halves and your pieces, and maybe a small portion of halves. So we don't play as dominantly in the USA like we do in China in terms of whole nuts. Whole nuts compared to your other style nuts are much more valuable, and it's a much more lucrative market for South Africa. So looking at where we play in the USA, we play in the ingredients market. And if you consider an ingredients market, your macadamia is used as an input to produce another end product. So depending on what the end product is, it's quite difficult for the buyers to make shifts or in terms of increasing or decreasing the portion of the nuts they can add. If there's 100 grams of macadamia nuts in a specific product, that's what they need to keep to. So alluding to that, if you look at global production is quite low this year. South Africa is a major producer, as well as Australia had unfavorable climatic conditions, and as a result we're quite low in terms of global macadamia production. So you look at the market we play into the USA, you look at local production, we're low year on year. It translates to a global shortage in terms of macadamia nuts in this particular season. And when there's a global demand, we do know that the person who's selling the product sits in an advantageous position, because they can say, how much are you willing to take this for? So the buyers are in a different position, because they still have to buy the macadamia. They still need to secure. So what is most likely to happen in this season, given the imports that are imposed on South Africa? There's a global shortage. So buyers are going to buy at higher prices. And when they do that, there's scope for South Africa, where they decide to sell, to move that imposed tariff or increased tariff cost onto the buyer, because it's either it's a take it or leave it situation. With the ability to do that, the buyer in this instance could be considered as a processor, a nutcracker. They are going to shift that price margin to the end consumer, because they are not going to absorb that. And the reason why they can't do that is because there's a global shortage. Now, when that is absorbed by the end, not the end producer, but the customer, which is a retailer, it is then going to create something I like to call max inflation, specifically within the US market.
High-value commodities are clearly a difficult nut to crack. Thank you, ladies, for sharing your expert analysis and helping us make sense. Of course, you can read the full report on high-value commodities in the spring edition of APSA's Agri-Trends Report, now available for download. Be on the lookout for our next discussion on vegetable production.
That's a wrap on our look at the livestock markets in APSA's 2025 Agri-Trends Spring Report. Thank you to agricultural economists Zama Sangweni and Kensani Mashimbi for their valuable perspectives. For further insights, visit Food for Mzansi's website. I'm Duncan Mosiwa, and this is Farmers Inside Track.